Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Today is our first philosophical episode, so if you're not into philosophical discussion, just bear with me, and next time I think I'll be doing some gun reviews or something like that. Anyway, the question that I want to discuss today is, who is God? Depending on whose statistics you believe, as many as 90% of Americans would say that they believe in God. Here in Idaho, we tend to be a very religious people, so it's probably an even higher percentage than the national average. But who or what is this God that people say they believe in? A while back, some friends of mine, went around and interviewed a bunch of people asking who or what they thought God was, and I was a little disconcerted by some of the answers that were given, especially by people who claim to be conservative Christians. Because these Christians, at least, would adamantly affirm that they believe in God, and yet when they're asked, who is this God that you believe in, many of them had trouble answering that question coherently. Some of them would fall back on cliches like, God is love, or God is our Father. But if God is love, then what is love? Is love just an emotion? Are you worshiping your feelings? I can think of some people who seem to do that, but I don't think that that's what the Bible authors intended when they penned that verse, God is love. Or God is our Father. Well, it's true that the Bible uses these familial analogies to help explain God's relationship or his interaction with his people, throughout the ages. But it's interesting. It uses the analogy of God being the husband of his people at least as often as it uses the analogy of a father. And yet, for some reason, when you ask people, who is God, many of them will say, well, God is our Father. None of them that I've ever seen would say, well, God is our husband. And I think that kind of underscores the fact that these analogies are useful analogies in their own right, but they're just that. They are analogies. They're not God's identity. So what I wanted to do today was take a few minutes to discuss what I think is the biblical answer to the question of who is God. Obviously, people of other faiths would answer this differently, but this is what I think the biblical answer to the question would be. And in the pages of Scripture, God actually answers this question himself in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. This is the story of the burning bush, where Moses is out on the backside of the desert. He sees a bush engulfed in flames, and so he goes to check it out, and God speaks to him out of the midst of the fire, tells him he's going to use him to bring the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. And during the course of this discussion, Moses asks God, who are you? When I go to the elders of Israel and tell them that you sent me to bring them out of Egypt, who do I say sent me? And God replies by saying simply, I am. Tell the people that I am sent you. And that might sound like kind of a funny answer. But when you think about it, and especially when you think about it in terms of what the Bible has already said about God, what the people of that time would have already understood about God, it actually makes more philosophical sense than any other answer that could be given. If you think about how we tend to identify ourselves, if somebody comes to me and says, well, who are you? I tend to express my identity in terms of concepts that I may adhere to, whether it's vocation or location. I'm an engineer, I'm an Idahoan, maybe I'm a member of this organization or that organization. We look to representatives of concepts that are more fundamental than our own expression or participation of those concepts in order to identify ourselves. But for God, that would be a problem, because God created the entire universe in which all of those concepts are defined. God ordained the space-time manifold to which our universe is constrained. He wrote the laws of physics. What can he refer to that's more fundamental than himself in order to define himself or identify himself? There's nothing more fundamental than himself for him to refer to. And so he simply says, I am. I exist. I define existence. That, I think, is what he's saying when he says that to Moses. So if God defines existence or defines reality, what does that really mean? I think that has a number of very interesting implications that I'd like to take a minute to talk about. For one thing, it means God is rational, because all statements of formal logic can be expressed in terms of existence. If condition or entity A exists, then condition or entity B must exist. That may be a very verbose way of stating our logical arguments or logical statements, but all statements of formal logic can be expressed in terms of existence. And so, as the one who defines existence, God defines logic, true logic. Another interesting implication would be that there is only one God, because you can only have one definition for reality. Reality encompasses everything that exists. Hypothetically speaking, we might be able to have multiple universes with different physical laws, different independent sets of space-time dimensions, that never interact. But but if they exist at all, then they're part of reality. And so there's only one reality, and therefore there can only be one definition of reality, only one entity that furnishes that definition. So that's another implication of God's identity as the one who is that he is only one. Another implication is that God is omnipotent, because the ability to define reality is really the only coherent definition of omnipotence. I think as beings confined within the physical constraints of this universe, we tend sometimes to come up with very shallow definitions of omnipotence. We think of it in terms of unlimited power, where power is a concept that is defined within the constraints and limitations that we ourselves face within this world. And if we let ourselves use that kind of a definition, then we get into questions like, well, if God is omnipotent, does that mean he can make a rock that's so big he can't lift it? And yet, the problem there is we're defining omnipotence in terms of the ability to make a rock and the ability to lift a rock, whereas, both of those are heavily dependent upon, physical parameters of the universe in which we live, of the reality, to which we are confined. So, if you define omnipotence as the ability to define reality, none of that is a problem, and if that's how you define it, and if God is the one who defines reality, then God, by definition, would be omnipotent. Another implication, if God is omnipotent, he is also invulnerable. That hopefully should be obvious. And yet, that leads to some very interesting implications in that it would be irrational for an invulnerable being to take defensive action. God's sovereign will is inviolable, and so it would be irrational for God to act out of self-interest. Yet God defines reason, as we said, so it would be out of character for God to do anything irrational. He cannot do anything irrational, and consequently we can say that God's character as a person is defined, or characterized, I should say, by an utter selflessness, an utter lack of self-interest. which in turn, we could say selfless regard for others is what characterizes true love. Thus, it is the character of God that defines the true character of love. And that, I think, is what is meant by the verse, God is love. It's not saying that we worship some kind of emotion. It's saying that God's character is what furnishes the ultimate definition for love itself. And so, if someone comes along and says, well, a loving God would never allow such and such to happen, where such and such is something that has actually happened, then, we can say that that person has obviously accepted a superficial definition of love that doesn't take into account the real character of God. And yet, if God defines love, that brings up another interesting implication, because love involves interactions between multiple entities, between multiple persons. And so, for God to define love without respect to any of his created beings, for God of himself to define love, he must consist of multiple persons. And this is maybe a little bit of a difficult concept to grasp, because we just said a minute ago that God is only one God. He's only one entity. And so we get into what is known in Christian circles as the doctrine of the Trinity. One God expressing himself or manifesting himself in multiple persons. It's not a logical contradiction when we consider the nature of God. It may appear to be if we think of God as something confined within the space-time dimensions of this universe. And let me give you a little analogy here. Would you say it's possible to have a round square? If you constrain your thinking to 2 dimensions, you'd probably say that's impossible. But actually, in 3 spatial dimensions, it's perfectly possible. And I have one right here. It's called a cylinder. You look at it that way, the 2-dimensional projection is square or approximately square. You turn it that way, and it becomes round. Similarly, if we think of God as a person or an entity confined within the spatial and temporal realities to which we are accustomed, then it would be impossible for him to be 1 and 3 at the same time. But as the definer of reality, God is not constrained within this space-time manifold that he created as a stage for the events of human history. And so that, while it doesn't necessarily help us to conceptualize the doctrine of the Trinity, because that's very difficult for us finite human beings to do, I think at least it allows us to understand that it's not a logical contradiction. It can be that way. So, just to recap, I think, who is God? Well, God is. God is the one who defines existence, who furnishes the definition for reality, and so he cannot define himself in terms of anything more fundamental than himself. That, I think, is the biblical answer to the question of who is God.